Give us a sense, because we hear a lot of anecdotal reporting, some reports about few here, few there. How big a problem is this?
It's a massive problem that continues to grow. So today we are talking about 660,000 asylum cases. If you want to compare that to a little over a decade ago, in 2010, we had about 100,000 asylum cases. And if you combine those asylum cases with all the different cases that would be in the immigration courts, including deportation orders, for example, we're talking about immigration courts facing upwards of 1.8 million cases, which is why asylum seekers, so many migrants, are waiting years in order to hear their cases heard.
So, Krish, my understanding is before all this happened, we didn't have enough people to hear all those cases, the pending cases. And now they seem to be ramping up substantially. I've seen numbers that back in 2019, the last time under President Trump, before we had the pandemic, it was something like 900,000 incidents across the border. It was now 2 million last year, and we're, I think, at 1.6 million so far this year. How can we ever process that many claims for asylum?
Yeah, I think it's important to put the 2 million in context because President Trump introduced a rule, Title 42, which was a purported public health rule, but really it was an immigration enforcement rule that was used that used public health rationale in order to apply it. So essentially, what it does is it allows for a migrant who crosses the border to be summarily expelled. There's no process. Customs and Border Patrol agents are actually against this rule because it means that people can try over and over again. So that is why that 2 million number is actually a little bit inflated. But I also think it reflects why we shouldn't have Title 42 in place. We should allow those who have legal claims to come to the southern border and make the case.
At the same time, there are those, you've heard from them, I'm sure, that say that, in fact, part of the problem we have right now is because President Biden very explicitly said he was going to change the rules so you didn't have to stay in Mexico as you made your case, and that was actually a form of moral hazard. It was encouraging people, maybe cruelly in some cases, to come across the border. What do you say to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand that we are not going to detain, deport, or deter our way out of what is a humanitarian crisis. What we need to do is recognize that last year we had the fewest number of immigrants coming into the US since 2010. And what that meant is that even Ukrainian refugees didn't have a real pathway until the Uniting for Ukraine program. So we had over 20,000 Ukrainian refugees come through the southern border. Because there is dysfunction across the immigration system, what ultimately happens is the southern border seems to be the only way to get into the country. And that reflects not just the administration's need to step up and create a coherent system, but it also reflects Congress's need to implement reform. We haven't had that for over 3 decades.
Well, that certainly sounds right to me. But these poor people, and let's be frank, I think probably every single person involved is not having an easy time of it in life. That's why they're in this situation. Have become sort of political footballs between Republicans and Democrats, the right and the left. People are running for midterm elections on it. And I don't hear either side particularly coming up with a solution. You're an expert. If you had your druthers, if you could do what you want to do, what would a reformed system look like?
Yeah, I think it would require us to understand what are the principal reasons for why people come into the country. Humanitarian reasons are obviously a key one. That requires us to have a robust refugee resettlement system, but also to allow those who do seek asylum at our southern border to have their day in court. Right now, we are at some of the lowest numbers of refugees coming into the country across both Republican and Democratic administrations. We used to have 95,000 as the target of refugees coming into the country. This year, we'll probably hit less than 20,000. And that's been consistent for the last several years. For economic visas, we're talking about H-1Bs, H-1As, H-2Bs. Those visas are significantly below what our market requires. So when we have 11.2 million jobs going unfilled, this is where immigration has to be a solution because we have the lowest birth rate since the census has been tracking this issue. And the truth is, we see these jobs, they go unfilled for years. And then the final piece is recognizing that family reunification is something that I think America is committed to in terms of reuniting families. But that is a decades long process. By some accounts, it's taking 2 decades for family members to sponsor family to come here.
Well, Krish, as you know, Bloomberg really deals with business and the economy. We have any number of economists and business people come here who say a version of what you just said is we need more immigration of some sort. Let's put aside exactly what sort. We need more people coming to the country to fill all those jobs. At the same time, I think most people agree that part of the definition of a country is being able to control its borders. Do we have control of our border, our southern border right now? I saw that Vice President Kamala Harris was asked that question. I'm not sure she had an answer.
Yeah. Um, and I think what you're saying is exactly right. The vast majority of Americans do not believe in either extreme of a completely open border or a completely closed border. Uh, of course, there are still irregular border crossings, which are problematic. And frankly, we shouldn't be looking at more antiquated solutions like a border wall where we've seen the workarounds. We should be using smart technology. Senator Coons, a friend of mine, has sponsored such legislation that has gone nowhere. So I think recognizing that we're operating in 2022 and we should be using the technology of this decade, I think is one critical part. But then I think it's important to understand because we keep hearing this label of illegal immigrants. When we talk about the people who have been, sent to Martha's Vineyard, for example, these are people who undertook months-long journeys. They sought out border officials. They were processed, they were documented, they were given their legal papers in order to pursue their legal cases. That's a legal right recognized by U.S. law, by international law. Now, of course, if economic migrants are coming across the border, there's got to be a better way. They should not be coming that route. But I think it's important to understand that for some of those who are seeking protection, they are legal, documented migrants, and they should be allowed to exercise their right in this country.
So we all hope that we sort this thing out, but as we're trying to get it sorted out, in the meantime, who is feeding these people? Who is giving them shelter? Who is bearing the burden of this? Because obviously a lot of communities, a lot of cities are really feeling a lot of pressure from it.
Yeah. So it's groups like mine, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. We have services for asylum seekers in Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Florida. And I think it's important to understand our facilities, they're not being overrun by asylum seekers. When we hear these words from, the Texas and Florida governor, just want to be clear that those states don't have robust services. The reason why these migrants come to those states is not because there is some massive social safety net and people feel like they're able to be, quote unquote, leeches on taxpayer dollars. That's not the case. It's actually congregations, community-based groups, private fundraising that allow for us to serve these individuals, to provide them a meal overnight, to provide shelter. Oftentimes, we work with churches so that we can help these people. And many of them are ultimately going somewhere else in the country. And so I think that's where it's important to understand, even for those coming to DC, for example, 90% of them have a destination somewhere across the country. The vast majority of those coming across the southern border have a family member, have some U.S. tie, and that's in part why they're coming here, because they know, though they're fleeing the most dire of circumstances, they might be able to get some support while they're waiting here. Vast majority of asylum seekers, it takes them many months in order to get work authorization.